real quick on the screen, right? I think lots of folks are familiar with mabl who are in the room. If you're not, hi, this is the mabl desktop app that we have on the screen right now. And I'm going to walk you through what the process looks like, creating some basic API tests, as Krista mentioned, and some other resources too that we might want to use on this journey. So, um, to get into an API test, we can just click New Test, go into API test. I have some ones that I pre-made, much like a cooking show, that we can take a look at over here. So I'm going to bring up this very simple single API call here in the test and run it. As Krista mentioned, right, API tests or API calls really have some fundamental components. And I'm really happy that Krista alluded to the fact that our UI here sort of mimics that flow because it's something that I was thinking about as we were joining today. So in the top, right, we have the initial request. So what are we going to send to our API? What request are we going to make? And in mabl, right, I can give that request a name so it is a little more clear what we're going to do. And so we're just going to get all stocks. As Krista mentioned, we're in a banking application. We'll see the UI in a bit, but we have a stock tracker that we can essentially add stocks to track and take them off, things of that nature. So we're going to get a list of all the stocks that are available. Literally, that's a get, like Krista mentioned. We're trying to fetch information from something. We have our API base URL, which you can see here, and then we just add a little bit of the endpoint name to the end. And so this is really helpful because a lot of times, if you notice, this is variable syntax in mabl, and since your API base URL is probably going to be the same across environment or across a particular environment, you can configure those individually in mabl, and then this automatically populates so you don't have to type the same thing over and over again. And then we put our endpoint, which in this case is stocks. Now, a GET request doesn't typically have a body in it, and so it's really the simplest kind of request that we can really make. I'll make a call out to authentication. Oftentimes, authentication can be the trickiest part of getting into an API. Thankfully, this API that we're using today does not have authentication in front of it, but it's worth mentioning. Lots of APIs might have token-based authentication. Maybe you have to do an OAuth workflow to get a token back. We can support all of those types of things, and we have some great documentation on help.mabl.com to help you through those particular aspects if you find them challenging. So when we send our request to our API, we get back a response. And in that response, you can see here we have what appears to be a list of different stocks. These are, if anyone wants to take a guess in the chat of, if you notice a theme here, we might see it later in the app too. But essentially, we get our list of stocks. And we can also make assertions against a response or essentially validate, right? Are we getting back data that we expect? And this is really the heart of any test, right? The checks that we make against any sort of response that we get, whether it's a response from an API or a response that we get after clicking a button on a website, making some sort of page transition, for example. So in this, we have a bunch of different kinds of assertions. And what this is really doing is taking a look at each of these properties. So for those who are not familiar, when we see brackets in a JSON response, that means it's an array. And when we see curly braces, kind of delineating these little sections, that's an object. And within that object, each of these bits of the response has a property. And so a property you can think of like almost like a field name in a database, for example. And so each stock has a symbol, each stock has a name and a price, a change in the price, and a change percentage. And then you can see, then we have another stock here. And so each one of those is represented and this little block within the curly braces. So each one of those is its own individual stock. If we come down here to the responses, we can see what this is really checking is that the response has an array that it has all of the fields that we just called out. So does each stock really have a symbol field, a name field, a price field, a change field, right? If one of those fields goes missing, let's say all of a sudden, someone introduces a bug and the symbol field just disappears. I guarantee you the front end of that website is going to be very unhappy, and all of the stock tickers for all of their users is going to be completely borked. So it's really important to check, the structure of your APIs, that they're coming back at some level. Really simple, basic tests that you can kind of do at the very beginning, get your feet wet. Similarly, if we come back up to results, just thinking about, running this test, up here in results, you can also see, whether or not those assertions that we made below have passed or failed. We can, let's make this one fail, for example. Let's just say, oh no, it's a 404, just like our mabl t-shirts that are so well regarded. So if we send this now, oh no, I made an error. And so it can say, hey, I was, I got this 200 code back, but I expected it to be 404 because that's what I put down here in the assertion. So I'll change that back to 200, send this again, and then that assertion should pass. So these again are the checks that we make against a given API. So basic components of a given API request and response. Now, let me bring up the actual application that we are testing here. So I'll bring this browser window over. And this is the page in our demo Mabel Bank app, not FDIC insured. But if we click stock tracker over here, you can see that we don't really have any stocks in this list yet. And what we expect a user to do is click the add button, and then it moves that stock card out of here up into this layer. And then we have a delete button that we click, and then it goes back in this list. So cool. What's happening behind the scenes, though, is that when I click add, there's a call going out to an API, and we might actually be able to see this in the network tab. So if I click add again, you can see, hey, there's this call to this API tracked stocks that's going. I can see the payload that's being sent, and I can also see the response that's coming back. This is the same kind of data that I can see in mabl as well when I'm building my test, but this is really what's happening behind the scenes when we're clicking these delete buttons and whatnot. You can see, more calls get made. So what I ultimately want to do is be able to test that at the API layer as well, because if something's broken and it doesn't work in the back end, it's definitely not going to work in the front end. And as Krista mentioned in her introduction, it's a lot faster to run API tests than UI tests. It's also often much cheaper, both in terms of infrastructure cost and time, to run API tests as well. So with that in mind, let's pop in and take a look at another test that we put together. And so we can say this one's our track stocks. And it has a few different actions. We're going to get a list of all of the stocks. We'll get a list of the tracked stocks, which should be 0 by default. We're going to add a stock to that list. We're going to try to add a duplicate stock to the list because that shouldn't happen, and make sure that we get the right error codes back. And then we're going to delete a stock from that list, just like I was showing in the UI. So if we click Edit Test, go into the API editor, we can see those different calls that we just looked at over here. And I'll just play these from the beginning. And thankfully they all passed. But let me give you a little tour through some of these calls. So this is a new endpoint, right? Tracked stocks that we were working with. And again, we're just doing a simple get, and we get back an empty array. So that signifies that there's nothing currently being tracked in that stock list, which is great. That's what we want. The next call is a post, finally. So now we have a post body that we can take a look at. And this is essentially, you might hear some people call this a payload. It's essentially another little bit of JSON, or it can be, other kinds of data too, that you essentially send to the API to do something with. Imagine if we're, looking at the front end of our stock tracker. When I click the little plus button, it's not just sending, oh, Daryl clicked a plus. How do we know? That data that we saw getting sent over in DevTools and contain the symbol. And so here we in the API request, you can see that we're sending over that symbol property with the symbol value of Swanson, which was over back here on the web page. And then when we send that, right, we get a response back from the API. And then the API essentially sends us the response, which is all of its current values, letting us know that it's been put in there. This adding a duplicate one is really just repeating the same request again, but we expect a different response now. And so now we expect there to be a different, not a 200, which is a everything's okay status code. We get instead a 409, which says there's some sort of conflict. And there's a conflict because we already added that stock before. So it's a duplicate. So we get an error. And then down here, we can go through and delete that. Now, that's great. This is a full, ultimately end-to-end workflow that, we just did on the front end as well. Um, if we go through and look at the time, right, it takes to run that test, it's right about a minute or so in the web. And in the web, right, we can see, some different, different great things like screenshots and whatnot. We get great log files, including, right, those network logs and activity of what's happening in the back end. But if we pop over to the API test and specifically our tracked one, right, this test runs in 1 second, just 1 second. And imagine, right? These are really simple workflows. Imagine, Vince, I'm sure everyone's booked a plane ticket before, right? We have to go through lots of different uh, activities on the front end and on the back end, as it follows, in order to get all of these, bits of data in the right place. So if we're thinking about an end-to-end workflow through some sort of e-commerce thing, right, that might be a, 5 minute, 6 minute test. I could add tons of more API calls in here and it would still, be like 3 seconds. So the speed at which these tests can run is super fast. And that's one of the great benefits about API testing. And I think also one of the reasons why it's a good idea to follow the testing or the automation pyramid, right? And get a really large chunk of API tests because they run so fast and give your team so much feedback. And you can run these against your local environments as well as production. So I can take a look, and before I could even drag the window over to the screen, it's already done and my tests are passed. So again, the speed of feedback is one of the great things about API testing. And real quick, just to show you through some of the more agentic things, right? This is creating a new API test, and I can, generate some basic CRUD test on the endpoints contained in my Swagger file. And then I click Upload Files. I can point to my API spec, which for those who are unfamiliar, if you've ever seen a web page like this with API documentation, this is essentially generated from a API spec document, like a Swagger file or an Open API spec. This is what the spec for our stock tracker API looks like in YAML or Markdown. Um, but there's also many tools that can render those documents, and you can see things like example values. These can be so instrumental when you're trying to build tests manually, so you can see examples of the payloads that you need to send over to these endpoints and whatnot. But you can also use those documents to generate some tests automatically with our test creation agent as well. I'll just point this at our production instance and click Create Test. And so now it's going to take a look through this document and essentially evaluate it and generate some tests. Now I gave it some a very loose prompt, right? I love the idea of exploratory API testing as a jumping off point to start, going deeper on certain endpoints where I think there might be a little more risk or there's more opportunity for users to submit, values. I love a search endpoint because then you can start playing with things like SQL injection prompts and, more fun, exotic sorts of things. Because users will submit all sorts of things to an input field. And you can test that and get ready for it and make sure that when someone does try to send some nasty payload to your API, you've already tested for it. So great, we got something back. We got a nice breakdown of 10 tests. I say, sure, this looks good. Or if I don't like those, I could refresh and it'll generate some different ones. Play a little bit of roulette. And so now if you can see, right, I've got, oh, it actually did a nice negative test of creating a duplicate stock like I had made before. Good job, agent. So you can see, right, we can kind of get all of these tests like done by the agent. And I love the ease of doing this. If we go through, right, we get a 404 where there's a stock not found. Maybe if I'm looking at this, it's trying to get a tracked stock before that we've added one in there. So I can come through, right? Maybe I just need to come in and update some of these assertions and say, actually, no, this is a negative test. I want to make it a 404, and I want to add an additional assertion that I believe it's error is the property. Perfect. That this error that I get back is actually stock not found. So super easy, especially when you have the actual response right up here above you that you can see and start building your assertions. So that's a little bit of how you can build your own API test using some nice resources that hopefully you have at your disposal. If you don't know whether you have a Swagger file, ask your friendly developer who might be nearby and may know this. Someone on your team, I think, can be a great resource to help you get started if any of this is new to you.